Hey guys, welcome to the first episode of Yalla Deals Podcast. My name is Adam and I'm the Business Development Executive here at Yalla Deals. Today we're going to be talking about buying versus renting property. And I've already written about this on the blog, but in this podcast we're going to discuss the benefits and the disadvantages of buying versus renting property. So, buying property is one of the most important decisions you may ever have to make in your life. I mean, how many properties are you really going to buy? The average person owns up to 3 homes during their entire lifetime. So, owning a house requires careful consideration of several factors. But should you buy or rent? This is what we're going to be talking about today. Now, the first thing that you got to do is that you have to take a good look at your finances. If you're considering buying, many people opt for financing by taking out mortgages rather than purchasing a home up front. Now, whether or not you have the cash, there are benefits and disadvantages to cash payments versus mortgages. So if you have the money, an obvious benefit would be no interest rates or mortgage fees. And sellers are more naturally inclined to sell to cash payers because they don't have to be concerned about loans or bank approvals. So if you have the money and you found the perfect home, you are more likely to be able to buy that home because sellers prefer people that have cash, naturally. If you have the money, then you may come to realize that sellers close the deal faster. And by the way, they may even offer you significant discounts, and that is true. Maybe this might not seem the case, but going for a mortgage also has benefits. Now, in an ideal world, taking out a mortgage and paying it back on time every month will not restrict your financial resources. Think about it. If you have a certain amount of money and you've used all that money, then you don't have anything left. It's like laying all your eggs in one basket. That is where renting shines, or that's where taking out a mortgage shines. You would be able to account for any kind of abrupt finances that would have been otherwise difficult to deal with had you purchased the property in cash. So whether you're buying a house cash or through a mortgage, there are several costs and considerations to keep in mind. Let's first of all talk about the advantages of buying. So the first advantage of buying is, I love this advantage, which is the peace of mind and the joys of ownership. This means that you're going to be the owner of the property. How does that make you feel? How does that make you feel, not having to deal with landlords or comply with their demands? Think about it just for a little bit. How does it make you feel to be the proud owner of a property? It feels amazing, doesn't it? Now, if you rent, and I've experienced this myself, you may have to sign a rental contract that is so exhaustive, it would frustrate anyone reading it with so many terms and conditions and articles, a plethora of policies and guidelines in their contract. And of course, their rights, the landlord's rights, and your obligations as a tenant. When you own the property, you are the boss. You are the landlord. And I've experienced this myself where I signed rental contracts, and in the contract, I can see my rights are, just like 1 or 2 lines, 2 lines to be exact. Something along the lines of, oh, you have the right to live peacefully in the premises, use the utilities provided, and avoid making noise. Those are your rights. But what about your obligations? Wow, your obligations. I once had a contract that was, I think, about 10 pages long. I'm not kidding, 10 pages long, of which only a tiny paragraph was my rights, and the rest was the landlord's rights, the developer's rights. So, you know where I'm going with this. If you buy a property, you will enjoy your own home. You'll have the joys of ownership and you'll have peace of mind. And I think this is an ideal solution for people that want to live in a house that they can call a home, and they want to live in it for a long time. So if you want to live in a house for a long time and you love that place, then a good idea would be to buy it because you want to live in it. But if you don't want to live in it for a long time, then maybe buying is not for you. And by the way, some developers have introduced a rent to own payment scheme in which the buyer can bypass that 25% down payment requirement or whatever it is. So this is ideal for buyers that want to go down the financing route with mortgages, but they can't fork out down payments. I've heard of some people that take out loans from the bank, go out and buy property, and then rent out those properties. According to Robert Kiyosaki, the author of Rich Dad, Poor Dad, that is a clear definition of an asset. So an asset is anything that puts money in your pocket, and a liability is anything that takes money out of your pocket. So if you buy a house and you live in it, that's actually not exactly an asset. That's a liability because it's taking money out of your property, out of your pocket. But if you're buying it and renting it out and you're getting rental income, then that turns the house into an asset. And for those people that take out loans and buy houses, that rental income that they're getting, they use that money to pay back the bank, which is a great idea. I mean, if you think about it, if you don't have any problems, okay, putting aside any kind of surprises, for example, people lose their jobs, people might get ill. So anything, if you set aside these kind of problems and you're able to repay the loan through rental income, some people are able to do it in 10 years, some people are able to do it in 15 years. But why do that when you have that rent-to-own payment scheme? So when you have a rent-to-own payment scheme, the buyer can bypass that down payment as well, and you're paying for rent, but then you're going to own it in the end. So I think this is also something to consider. That's like one of the advantages of buying. Another advantage, like I said, is if you buy that house and turn it into an income-generating asset. Houses are considered assets if they put money. That's what if they put money in your pocket, that's what we just talked about. That will render your property a tangible income-generating asset. But paying for rent, on the other hand, that takes money out of your pocket, so that's a liability. You should keep that in mind. Rent is actually a liability. Let's just keep it as simple as Robert's understanding. If you haven't read the book, I recommend you read the book. It's called Rich Dad, Poor Dad by Robert Kiyosaki. He also has several other books on investing, financing, and all that stuff. Now, another advantage would be a sense of stability and belonging. If you buy a house, you finally feel that you're at home. This may not sound like some sort of real asset, but it's actually an intangible advantage. It offers solace to people. Some people may view the property as a family heirloom, and that can be inherited and passed on to future generations. And that adds sentimental value to the house. So that's another advantage in my book. The next advantage would be, and by the way, I see this a lot, which is parking availability, including guest parking for certain properties. So if you own the property, you would always own your parking spot, depending on the type. And as you may already know, in some places in Dubai, it might be very difficult to find parking. Now, in Sharjah, it might even be more difficult to find parking, and maybe in other Emirates as well. So if you own your own property, that will mean that you probably have your own parking spot and it belongs to you. And that's really nice. Now, this can make your parking spot always available to you and may even provide more privacy and security than, let's say, parking your car outside an apartment complex where it can get hijacked or stolen. It's true for villas, especially true for villas or townhouses, but that's if you install your own security camera. And apartment buildings with security guards and built-in parking lots and CCTV cameras can also work. So the point is, you get more security, more privacy, and you get the convenience of having your own parking because it's your house, your parking, your rules. And maybe even guests don't have to pay for parking if they want to visit. That's an added bonus. Now, the next advantage is equity accumulation. According to market trends, supply and demand, inflation, the resale value of your property may go up in time. Now, what does that mean? It means that you may be able to sell your property and make a considerable profit. However, it is not ideal for someone who wants to keep the property for a long time and is not considering reselling it or using it to generate income. If you want to buy the property and keep it for a long time, maybe pass it down to future generations, that is a good idea, and it will accumulate equity. And of course, it depends on market trends and supply and demand. So if you want to resell the value, if you want to resell the property, your property might gain value, but this is not true all the time. Sometimes property lose value. But if you want to buy this property and live in it and not resell it, then it's not exactly for you. But in any case, a lot of properties gain value. They accumulate equity in time. So the resale value of the property may go up in time, and that's an advantage. And finally, the last advantage for buying property would be renovation friendly. The property would be renovation friendly. So since you own the property, this means that you can upgrade or modify, renovate, demolish, do whatever you want with your property according to your style, your taste, your rules. So if you rent, most landlords don't allow you to make any kind of modifications to their property, and I know this for a fact. I wanted to make some modifications, they didn't allow it. And even if you do, most of them would require you to give the property back. You have to give it back to them in its original condition, or you risk losing your security deposit, and of course you might incur additional clearance charges. So that means buying property will give you the convenience of doing whatever you want with your house. If you rent property, you can't do much. All right, guys, now let's move on to the disadvantages of buying property. Of course, the most important disadvantage would be the high upfront costs. That includes down payments, monthly mortgages, DLD fees if you're living in Dubai. So if you are planning on getting financing from a bank or any other institution, financial institution, most properties require hefty down payments. Now we're talking about tens or even hundreds of thousands of dirhams or dollars to start your ownership journey. If you have all the amount, then that may be equivalent to putting, of course, like we said in the beginning, all of your eggs in one basket. This is all connected. Down payments in Dubai are at least 20% for expats and can go all the way up to 40% of the property's purchase price. So this means that rental security deposits are much, much cheaper for, let's say, if you want to rent a house, an apartment, let's say, it's usually about 5% of the annual rent. And if you want to rent, let's say, something that costs 100,000 dirhams, so that's going to be 5,000 dirham security deposit, which is much less than if you want to buy a property and you have to fork out down payments that are at least 20% for expats that can go all the way up to 40%. Now, mortgage payments are usually more expensive than rental payments. So that's also a disadvantage, and that may take a toll on your financial resources. You also have the headache of dealing with interest rates if you take out a mortgage. Now, if you default on a loan, God forbid, then you may be in trouble. You're also required to pay the DLD. The DLD is the Dubai Land Department. So you are required to pay the DLD fees, which are 4% of the property value, and fees for paperwork such as admin fees or agent's fees. And by the way, these agent fees can go all the way up to 2%. You also have to deal with NOC charges and other matters. So when you're talking about buying property, you are talking about high upfront costs. Now, the next disadvantage of buying property would be more paperwork and possibly more stress. You know what that means. You have to deal with so many things such as the title deed. These are all complicated paperwork. It doesn't have to be complicated if you know what you're doing, but if you don't know what you're doing, it can be complicated. So you may end up needing a lawyer. You have to deal with a title deed, the sale agreement. You have to know exactly what's written in the sale agreement. You have to deal with tax, but that's only if you're living outside the UAE. Thank God we don't have that here. Completion certificates, insurance, NOCs, power of attorney. Maybe you might need that. Mortgages and building plans, and zoning regulations if you have to. It would be a good idea, like I said, to hire a lawyer or a closing agent to close the property so that you can avoid any kind of legal loopholes or surprises found in the MOU, the Memorandum of Understanding, or the sales agreement. Now, although the DLD introduced standard unified contracts, you can see that on their website. They have standard unified contracts for that to regulate the relationship between buyers and sellers and brokers. There may still be things to account for down the road. Your financial responsibilities will also be more significant, by the way, than renting a property, and that exposes you to a world of stress. If you live in a country that charges annual taxes for home ownership, then you will also have to worry about that too. However, you may also have tax benefits, but this is outside the scope of this podcast because it focuses on the UAE and particularly on Dubai. So there is no taxation on properties in Dubai, in the United Arab Emirates. You may also have to worry about foreclosures if you default on your mortgage, God forbid. Imagine the traumatic experience of having your property taken away from you through a foreclosure if you don't pay your loan, especially if you have already covered a portion of your mortgage, like let's say a considerable portion of your mortgage, after a certain number of years. That really feels bad. Unfortunately, banks will not care whether you've lost your job or you have health problems or you have any kind of other problems that have caused you to fall behind on paying your loan payments. They don't care about that. So while failing to pay rent promptly can subject you to fines and eviction, the prospect of losing your home can have a more gut-wrenching negative experience if your home is financed. Keep in mind that banks may require security checks or collateral from you. They will have absolutely no qualms whatsoever cashing out these security checks if you default on payments. So keep that in mind. The next disadvantage would be for buying property, unpleasant surprises and repairs. So the property that you bought may have problems that were not apparent during your first visit, especially if it's not a new property, such as hidden structural or foundation problems, expensive leaks, and plumbing disasters or electrical problems or bad wiring, infestations, let's say like cockroaches or rodents. You might have a rodent problem. I've seen properties that have rats dwelling in there and rats chewing on wires, CCTV wires. So you got to keep in mind that problem. And you also have mold. You might have a mold problem, maybe underneath the tiles or maybe in the walls. You got to be careful about that. The list goes on for any kind of surprises and repairs. Home inspections are crucial, and you can save yourself a lot of money and avoid a bad investment if you hire a professional surveyor to inspect the premises. Although this practice is not very common in the UAE, I strongly recommend it. As a civil engineer, because I come from a civil engineering background, I once prepared something called a property condition report, a PCR, the work product resulting from completing something called a property condition assessment, or a PCA. So this PCR is a written report prepared according to the ASTM's recommendations and guidelines. ASTM stands for the American Standards for Testing and Measurements. So these are recommendations and guidelines. It can be prepared after conducting a walkthrough survey. So what does this report actually do? It outlines observations and opinions related to the subject property's conditions to remedy any kind of material deficiencies observed, and it also offers an opinion on the subject property's overall physical condition, so it opines on the condition, and it provides a description of various components and systems. Now, PCRs also outline probable costs to remedy physical deficiencies. So if you're buying a home, you might be in for an ugly surprise if you're not careful. PCAs are necessary before any home purchase. I highly recommend them. But keep in mind that they will also add to the overall cost of buying a house. So PCRs are absolutely important if you want to buy a house, if you want to get a sense of a peace of mind. If you want to have peace of mind and if you want to make sure that the property has no problems or underlying structural defects, then you have to get a PCR. I highly recommend this. So the next disadvantage for buying property would be the extra risk for off-plan properties. An off-plan property is still unfinished and under construction. The main benefit of purchasing an off-plan property is lower rates in comparison to market rates. Developers can sell at discounted rates such as 10% or even 20% because they want to ensure their properties are sold early while the development project is still under construction. However, you should consider the risks associated with an unfinished property, including incompletion or unexpected delays in delivery dates. So my advice is look for reputable developers and always read your sales and purchase agreement, your SPA, carefully. it would be beneficial for you to pay the remainder upon receipt of the building completion certificate, the BCC. Now, there's also the risk of finding out years later that the property's actual value is nowhere near the price you had paid for initially, especially if you had already covered a certain amount, such as, let's say, 30% of the cost. So if you are buying off-land properties, which means that the properties that are still unfinished, there's always a risk. Keep that in mind. For me, I prefer buying property that is ready-made, but that's just me. There's nothing wrong with buying off-plan property, but there's always the risk of not meeting your expectation. There's the risk of losing value in comparison to the initial price that you paid for. And maybe there's also the risk of property delay, the construction delays, or any kind of problems during construction. Some people had to wait for a very long time for their property to be constructed. I saw that. This is a real risk for off-plan properties. This is one of the risks for buying property if you are buying property. The next disadvantage for buying property is, of course, maintenance costs. You will be responsible for fixing any major maintenance issues in your house, such as HVAC problems, leakages, and other kind of problems. If you rent, on the other hand, most landlords take up that responsibility. That's a good thing. That's at least that will take that off your chest. They will take up that responsibility, or at least they will pay partially for it. For instance, once I rented out an apartment in Dubai and the AC had a big problem. My bedroom was constantly freezing like I was living in Antarctica. Now, after lodging my complaint with the landlord, a maintenance company inspected the AC and concluded that the thermostat needed to be replaced. And that had a high repair cost. I ended up paying a small amount of it, which the landlord paid for the chunk of the bill. In other apartments, the landlord, primarily a developer, the landlord is responsible for all significant issues in your apartment. For that, you have to refer to your rental contract and see exactly what's written there. However, smaller maintenance items, keep that in mind, such as lining fixtures or faucets or things like that, they may be excluded from the landlord's free maintenance. It all depends on the landlord and it depends on the terms of your contract. But most landlords cover maintenance costs, especially expensive ones, for the AC, for any leakage problems, things like that. Now, the next disadvantage for buying property is service charges. For many properties, you'll also be liable to pay annual service charges, especially if you bought, let's say, an apartment. You have to pay those annual service charges to the developer. You may also be stuck with a property for a long time, and that's a disadvantage. So that's inflexibility. If you do experience any of the problems, by the way, that I just mentioned, you may find out that these problems are too complex, too time-consuming, or maybe they're even expensive to remedy. You may, especially if they're structural problems, keep that in mind. If you did not go for that PCA that I told you about, which is always a good idea. So you may also change your mind. You may want to move out. You might have some problems with the property, maybe not inherent with the property itself, but maybe problems that are surrounding the property. You might have, I don't know, horrible neighbors, noisy neighbors. Maybe you might not like the location. For whatever reason, if you suddenly decide you want to change the property, you simply just can't bail. Unlike rent, where you can get out anytime you wish, legally, of course. And by the way, keep in mind that you have to pay 2 months rent if you suddenly want to, get out of your contract. But you can change your property either by waiting until your rental contract expires or by incurring 2 months rent if you suddenly decide to get out. If you're buying property, you can't just suddenly change your mind. Now, even if you choose to sell it in the market, the process takes time, takes paperwork, and the problem that forced you to sell the property may still rear its ugly head if you still can't fix it. You should never, by the way, under any circumstances, lie to the next buyer about the actual condition of your house or any defects that it has, because it's just unethical. Just don't do it. It's unethical, maybe even illegal. The point is, I'm trying to make here, if you want to suddenly change your house, you don't like it anymore for whatever reason, you want to change it and you just bought it. To make it worse, if you took out a loan or a mortgage from a bank, It's not simple. It can be done, of course. You can resell the house, but it's more complicated. It might cost you more. You may lose more, and you don't have that kind of flexibility in comparison with rent. And finally, the last disadvantage that I want to talk about is the loss of value and depreciation. There is a myth, by the way, that I want to talk about, and this myth says this: property always increases in value. Now, this myth, I don't know where it came from, but it's a myth, and it's not true, and it's not valid. It all boils down to several factors, such as market conditions, location, renovations, new commercial businesses, supply and demand. All these kind of factors affect the price or the value of your property. And sometimes you may lose a quarter, half, or even double your home's purchase value. And that sucks. It really does. But the opposite is also true. So if you are an investment property owner, depreciation also comes into play, which is the loss in value of a property over time due to physical deterioration. Your property will deteriorate eventually because of, environmental conditions, for example. It will age, and that will depreciate your property. However, on the plus side, of course, certain properties in certain locations, their value goes up. But don't forget that this is a disadvantage as well. On the other side, flip the coin. This myth is not true, that property always increases in value. All right, guys, now that we've talked about the advantages and disadvantages of buying property, let's talk about the advantages of renting. The first advantage, the obvious advantage, is lower upfront costs. So deciding to rent a property will cost you much, much less than owning one in the very beginning, at least in the short term. It is essential to consider if you don't have sufficient funds to buy a property through a cash purchase, for example, or even financing. Down payments are at least 20%, like we said, in Dubai if you want to buy. So an obvious advantage would be lower upfront costs. So if you don't have the money, an obvious advantage would be rent, or an obvious choice would be rent. The next advantage for renting property is less paperwork. And just like we discussed earlier, if you buy property, it's much more complicated. You have to deal with so many things like the sales contract, insurance, taxes if you're living somewhere else. All these kind of things. You will or may need a lawyer as well if you're buying property. But if you're renting, you don't need to do all that. You just sign the rental contract and you just get your ijari done, and that can be processed, by the way, by the real estate agent. So less paperwork. Increased flexibility and mobility is also another advantage. Owning a house comes with a disadvantage of being stuck with it for a while, like we just said, at least until you can sell it. As for rent, it's not a problem at all. You can enjoy moving out of your rented space anytime you wish, either before renewing your contract or by providing 2 months' notice, of course, to the landlord and paying the equivalent of 2 months. You can't just simply bail and get out. You have to inform the landlord and pay 2 months' rent. Or you just wait it out until your contract ends and then you decide and then you can move. The point is, for people who want flexibility in their lives, such as nomads, this can be exhilarating. People that want to change. Some people love change. So having multiple options constantly will satisfy these kind of people. Renting may also be suitable for people who have just moved to a specific location, and these kind of people are uncertain of their surroundings. People whose jobs or income sources, let's say, are not steady or stable. So rent for these kind of people is perhaps a better option. The next advantage would be peace of mind. Yes, with rent, you also have peace of mind, just like buying property. Each side has its advantages. Let me explain. For renting property, just like home ownership has peace of mind, it also has peace of mind because you have less commitment than owning a house. You don't have to worry about all the financial strains attached to buying a home. You don't have to worry about things like depreciation, losing market value, the fees associated with owning a property, closing costs, taxes, which are applicable outside the UAE, service charges if you have something like an apartment. So in short, if the property belongs to someone else, so too are its inherent ownership costs and problems. It's not your problem, it's the owner's problem. And that's simply peace of mind for you as a tenant. Next advantage would be worry-free maintenance. And we talked about that for buying property. For buying property, you'd have to pay for all of that. But for renting property, most landlords provide at least 1 year of free comprehensive maintenance for their properties. If it's a well-reputable real estate company or developer, it might be even more than a year. So they will fix major issues in your property, like we said, and some of them don't have a limit for fixing things, and some of them do. Some of them have certain additional requirements. But the point is, the majority of landlords, real estate companies, developers, whoever, that are these kind of people that are letting you rent this property, the landlords, they will cover major maintenance to the premises, such as AC units, electrical distribution boards, heat and smoke detectors, fixing any kind of waterproofing or leakage problems. They can replace water heaters. They can fix your floor and tiles. Now, keep in mind, though, that all these maintenance items are not applicable if you or your visitors cause any damage. In this case, you are responsible for repairing such damage. Now that we've talked about the advantages of renting, let's talk about the disadvantages for rent. The first major disadvantage for rent is the lack of ownership. And I know that it sounds too obvious, but let's talk about it. First, let's talk about the elephant in the room, which is home ownership. How does that make you feel, by the way? If you rent a property, how does that make you feel? No matter how pretty, no matter how much time or money you've spent renovating it or taking care of it, it's still not yours to keep. You may have to move out one day. Not may, you will move out one day. It's not yours. You will have to answer to your landlord. So if the landlord wishes to evict you and reclaim the property for whatever reason, they can do that. They can absolutely do that to the fullest extent of the law by giving you notice. And that notice may be like a year, maybe even less. So the point is, it's an unpleasant experience for some people, especially if they loved the property. If you own your house, no one can evict you unless you default on your payments, for example, or you break the law. But if you purchase a home and complete its payments, either by cash or through a mortgage, you don't have to worry about spending money on rent. So some people feel, and this is, by the way, true for a lot of people, some people feel that, even I feel the same way, that money paid for rent is thrown away. And you can't help but have that nagging feeling that may remain for many years, especially once these people leave the premises. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is called an opportunity cost. So for people that have lived in a certain place for a very long time and they never bought a house and they paid rent for many, many years, that's true. These people would feel bad because they can't help but feel that they've wasted all that money on rent. That's a major disadvantage to think of. Now, the next disadvantage is higher long-term expenses. This one is relevant to the previous disadvantage. Now, imagine renting a property for years, and this is what I was going to tell you. It leads to this. Imagine if you're renting it for a number of years and having nothing to show for in the end. It sounds like a sad novel, doesn't it? Back to Robert Kiyosaki's simplified view of assets versus liabilities. Paying for rent takes money out of your pocket, and that is a liability. Let's keep it as simple as that. The next disadvantage is unpleasant rental increase surprises. You may have an unpleasant surprise, by the way, when your landlord suddenly decides they want to increase your rent, and it happens. However, and there's a flip side to this, there's hope. The Real Estate Regulatory Authority, which is RERA, states that a landlord must provide 90 days of notice for increasing the rent amount. And not only that, there are rental caps. Landlords can't just simply go ahead and increase the rent however they please. They have to go according to market standards, market conditions. You have to check with RERA, by the way, if the landlord is actually entitled for that rental increase. You can still dispute it if they're doing it illegally. It has all got to be done according to RERA. So this applies to the previous disadvantage. If the landlord decides to end the contract or evict you, this also is unpleasant. Rental increases are absolutely unpleasant to any kind of tenant. Limited options. That's true. If you rent, your options are limited. Let me explain. Because they're not so renovation friendly. And we've talked about this when it comes to buying a house. You have more freedom. Because this home is not yours, because it was purchased by someone else, its current design or status may still not suit you or your needs. So upon vacating the premises, most of these landlords require the tenants to return the property to the landlord in the previous condition, exactly as it existed before the contract's commencement date. And let me let you in on a little secret. No matter what you do, you're still going to pay for some maintenance costs to bring the property back to its original condition. Take paint, for example. You're going to have to pay for some paint touch-ups at least, even if you try to keep the property in the most pristine condition. I remember a developer telling me that once before I left the property. I said, "Do you actually really have to pay for this?" And he said, "You know what? Let me let you in on a little secret. Yes, you have to pay for this." So before vacating the premises, most landlords will require you to pay for something to return or restore the property back to its original condition. And that money usually is taken from the security deposit. So that's a disadvantage. It's not renovation friendly, and you don't have that many options to modify the property. And even if you do, by the way, even if you do modify the property, you still have to return it the way it was in its original condition. For example, let's say you rent out an office space, and let's say the false ceiling had a problem and the lights are ugly and very unsightly, and you decide to go ahead and renovate the entire place. Well, guess what? The landlord may still require you to return the property in its original condition. Unless they like the renovation, of course. I don't know if that's the case. But anyway, most of them, they still do want you to return it in its original condition. And that is mentioned in the rental contract. So make sure you read the rental contract carefully. Otherwise, you risk losing your security deposit or incur additional fees. The final disadvantage for renting property is unpleasant contractual terms. Make sure you go through all the articles mentioned in the rental contract, like I said before, no matter how long. For instance, you may be surprised to find out that pets are not allowed on the premises or something else is not allowed, and you have a pet. What are you going to do? Unfortunately, you're going to have to follow the landlord's rules. It's their property. It's not yours, and you agreed to that. You signed the contract. It's mentioned in the rental contract. Another unpleasant surprise that I had personally experienced was actually still experiencing, is an annual rental contract renewal fee. And by the way, this is not applicable for all properties. Some of them do have this, some of them don't. And that can cost you a few thousand dirhams, by the way, and is usually mentioned in the contract's addendum. It's an additional piece apart from the contract. The contract is a standard contract, by the way, that comes from the government. But the addendum is an additional piece to that contract, and the landlord can, or the developer, let's say the real estate company, not the landlord, usually the real estate company, they will add something like, some of them, not all of them, they can add a contract renewal fee. In my case, for example, I have to pay 1,500 dirhams a year for renewing the contract. Another developer used to charge me 500 dirhams for renewing the contract. The current developer is charging me 1,000, not a developer, the current real estate company is charging me 1,500 dirhams for renewing the contract. Other developers may charge you even more. Now, I asked a real estate company about this, and they said, this is absolutely contingent upon the developer or the real estate company. There is no rule that says that they can or can't do this, but if it's mentioned in the addendum, then you have to fulfill that requirement. Maybe it's better for you in that case to search for property that does not have an annual contract renewal fee. There you go. That's advice I can give you. In the end, ladies and gentlemen, it all comes down to this. The should I buy or rent conundrum is more relevant today than ever. Property prices are shifting towards a buyer's market. There are several factors to consider to make the most informed decision and the decision that suits your personal and financial needs. So the best way to answer this kind of question for yourself is to answer the following questions truthfully. Let me ask you these following questions. Think about these questions carefully before you answer, and then you can make the most informed decision. The first question would be, can you afford to buy a home? Realistically, can you, whether by cash or through financing? Realistically, again, what can you afford right now? Be honest to yourself. Second question would be, do you have a steady, stable source of income that can cover mortgage payments for years to come? Yes or no? Third question, are you looking for short-term or long-term? Fourth question, do you need flexibility and more options anytime? Can you handle all the costs associated with owning a home, such as maintenance, service charges, taxes if you're living outside the UAE, and others? Do you know where you're currently standing and where you're heading with your career and family goals? That's a very important question, actually. Do you have a backup plan in case things go awry? And these are the questions that you have to answer. Remember, only you can answer these questions. No one else can, because you know you the best. No one else knows you like you do. Contemplate the information I talked about in this podcast, the information that I presented to you, and find out what works for you best. The bottom line is this. If you're looking for a property that you want to live in for a long time, maybe you want to pass it down to future generations as well, maybe buying a property for you. If you're looking for something that is short term, if you want more flexibility, if you want more options, if you want to be able to renovate however you choose, then buying is better for you. Renting is not good for you if you want more renovation options, but renting is good for you if you want flexibility in terms of bailing anytime you want or changing the property anytime you want, then rent is for you. I think it all comes down to this. For short term, rent is a better option for some people. For long term, buying is the better option for most people, because rent has less upfront costs, but in the long term, rent is actually more expensive than buying property. And buying property is the opposite. It has higher upfront costs, but in the long term, buying is actually cheaper than renting. And at the end of the day, you have something to show for. But rent can give you the flexibility you need, can save your money if you have to. It all boils down to your personal preference, your financial needs, your circumstances. Think about all the stuff that I mentioned today, answer these questions that I asked, and hopefully this podcast would be helpful to you for making a decision of whether or not you should buy or rent. Thank you guys for listening to this podcast. I'll see you in the next one. Have a great day.